Hello, I'm Chad Welch, and this is Annihilationism, Helpful Conversations, a series of videos I'm doing on the subject of annihilationism or conditional immortality, primarily designed to help my fellow pastors and Christian workers as they deal with those that are getting drawn into annihilationism, to help them have information and understanding on this topic, the issues, and just walking through my studies into annihilationism and the conclusions that I've reached. And hopefully they'll be helpful to those out there that are dealing with this matter or issue. Secondarily, I hope that if there's annihilationist or conditionalist out there that are watching these videos, they might carefully consider the thoughts that I present here and the study that I've done as it helps them process information, process this subject of conditionalism or annihilationism. So I hope you find these videos helpful. This particular video is going to be on Mark 9. At the end of Mark 9, Jesus speaks of the punishment of hell, and he talks about an unquenchable fire and worms that do not die. As is pointed out by the annihilationist or the conditionalist, and many of those that believe in eternal conscious torment do not understand this, but these words are a quotation from Isaiah 66:24. In Isaiah 66:24, these words apply to dead bodies. And so for the annihilationist, they will look back to Isaiah 66:24 and show that these words are applied to dead bodies there, and therefore it should not be understood to be a quotation that indicates eternal conscious torment, since the bodies are dead. And this argument is very strong and very convincing to many. And so for the conditionalism or annihilationism, they argue based off of Isaiah 66:24 that this cannot mean eternal punishment in the lake of fire, since Isaiah 66:24 is talking about dead bodies. Mark 9 is indeed quoting Isaiah 66:24, and the Old Testament is reference to dead bodies. So how do we, as those that believe in eternal punishment, understand these verses in light of Isaiah 66:24, which talks about dead bodies? And so I'll address this in this passage, and I give us an understanding of how Isaiah 66:24 is used, how Mark 9, how Jesus uses Isaiah 66:24 in Mark 9. Let's begin our study by simply walking through Mark 9 very simply in these verses. In these verses, Jesus is threatening punishment. And he's threatening punishment for anyone who would dare to offend one of the little ones that believes in him. It is very similar to Matthew chapter 18, and we could look at Matthew chapter 18 for similar thoughts to understand what Jesus is threatening here. But again, let's walk through Mark chapter 9 here and see what is being said. And in Mark 9 verse 42, Jesus says this, "But whoever causes one of these little ones who believes in me to stumble, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea." And so here Jesus simply expresses the idea that a horrible, horrible earthly death in which one is drowned in the depths of the sea, this horrible earthly death would be better for a person than the judgment that he is threatening. And so again, just a simple thought here. It'd be better to go through this horrible earthly death than to experience what I'm telling you about. All right, we go on now to verse 43. Verse 43 says this, "If your hand cause you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter into life maimed, rather than having two hands to go to hell, into the fire that shall never be quenched." First of all, he indicates in this passage that a handicapped, painful, difficult life on this earth is better than what he is threatening them with, is better than the judgment that he is saying will come to them. Verse 42, we saw, spoke of a horrific death. and said that the punishment he is threatening them with is worse than a horrific death in this life. Verse 43 speaks of a horrific or terrible earthly existence and indicates a horrific earthly existence is better than the threatened punishment that he is talking about. So verses 42 and 43 come together to help us understand that there is no earthly experience, whether it is ongoing earthly difficulty and hardship, or it is a horrible, horrific death, no earthly experience is worse than the threatened punishment that he is talking about. Now, we will go on and I think understand here that what he is threatening is not an earthly experience. It is not an earthly punishment. And he is indicating that there's nothing on earth that you will go through that will be worse than what he is threatening here. So Jesus is threatening a judgment. He says that this judgment is worse than any horrific earthly death, and that this judgment is worse than any horrific earthly existence. He then goes on to say that what he is talking about is hell. And I know there is discussion among the conditionalist or the annihilationist that hell or Gehenna is talking about the valley of Hinnom outside of Jerusalem, in which there is a prophesied earthly judgment in the book of Jeremiah. And they will indicate that Jesus is referencing that earthly future judgment prophesied in the book of Jeremiah when he threatens hell. Now, I have an entire video dedicated to Gehenna and Jesus' use of the word Gehenna, and I think laying out a good case that he is not talking about the earthly judgment prophesied in Jeremiah that takes place in the valley of Hinnom, but simply that the horrific prophesied judgment of the valley of Hinnom is a good illustration of the afterlife judgment that takes place in hell. And we see in that video that there are Jewish traditions and quotes from the day of Jesus that clearly indicate that Gehenna is being used as a picture of the judgment in the afterlife. The early church fathers use hell or Gehenna as a reference to a fiery judgment in the afterlife. And Jesus' own usage of the term hell or Gehenna does not indicate a future earthly judgment, but indicates a judgment in the afterlife. For a quick reference, Matthew 10:28 would indicate this, when Jesus says, "Don't fear those that can kill the body, but fear him who is able to destroy both body and soul in Gehenna." In fact, in the Luke passage, the parallel passage to that, he says, "Fear him who, after he kills the body, is able to judge the body and soul in Gehenna," and so indicates that this is a judgment that takes place in the afterlife and is not an earthly judgment. And so I think, again, you can watch that video. I think it lays out pretty clearly that Jesus' use of Gehenna or hell is not referencing that earthly judgment prophesied in Jeremiah, but rather the Jeremiah prophecy, it becomes a good illustration for us of the judgment in the afterlife. And so Jesus says hell here, and Gehenna, which was speaking of a judgment, a fiery judgment for those that have passed away. And so this is what Jesus is talking about. There is no earthly experience, no horrific earthly death, nor is there any horrific earthly experience that is going to be worse than the judgment of hell in the afterlife that he is threatening them with. And so then he says hell, and then he says into a fire that shall never be quenched. And so as we seek to understand Jesus' words, we know that the conditionalist or the annihilationist will say that an unquenchable fire is not a fire that never burns out, but it is a fire that burns until it has consumed the object that is on fire. And so it will never be quenched until it has consumed the city that it is burning or the gates that it is destroying. And so I am not going to look into all of those passages on unquenchable fire today, but we will look at Isaiah 66:24. I intend to do another video sometime on the unquenchable fire. But nevertheless, let's understand what he says here. He speaks of a fire that shall never be quenched. Um, and whether that is until it has consumed the object it is burning or it is never ever going to end, he speaks of hell as a place where the fire will never be quenched. Now, once Jesus has started to make this threat, indicating that no earthly experience or earthly death is worse than what he is threatening them with, he then mentions hell, which for the Jewish people of that day was a reference to the fiery judgment in the afterlife. He references hell, and then he talks about a fire that is not quenched. He then quotes Isaiah 66:24 to help us understand the nature of hell. He starts by saying where. Okay, that where is a reference to hell. He is going to quote Isaiah 66:24 to help us understand the nature of hell or the nature of the fiery judgment in the afterlife. And so Gehenna, he's threatening them with Gehenna, the fiery judgment in the afterlife. He says now where in hell, where, and then he's going to quote Isaiah 66:24. And so he says, where in hell, this is what it's going to be like. The worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. And so then he quotes for us Isaiah 66:24 to help us understand the judgment in the afterlife, to help us understand hell, the fiery judgment of God after mankind has passed away on this earth. There's some discrepancy here on Mark and exactly what the actual wording in the original were. I don't think any of that discussion makes a difference on our discussion today, so we will just kind of go through the passage as traditionally understood here. Verse 45, again, talks about a miserable earthly existence is better than facing the judgment Jesus is talking about. Verse 46, he quotes Isaiah 66:24 again. Then in verse 47, he talks again about a miserable earthly existence is better than facing the judgment Jesus is talking about. Verse 48, he quotes Isaiah 66:24. And so in each of these places, he threatens them with the fiery earth or fiery judgment in the afterlife called hell. And then he quotes Isaiah 66:24 to help us understand the nature of that fiery judgment. And so that kind of takes us through a brief survey of Mark chapter 9 and these verses here as Jesus threatens them with hell. And now we'll take a look at Isaiah 9 or Isaiah 66:24 to see how Jesus uses it. All right, let's take a look at what exactly Isaiah 66:23 and 24 say. It starts out, and my understanding is it is talking about the millennial kingdom. It is talking about a time when upon this earth, in earthly history, where Christ has established his throne, and that the people of the earth, there's worship in Jerusalem, and the people of the earth are coming to worship again in Jerusalem. But regardless of some people's interpretation, and some people don't understand that there's a millennium, this is what Jesus says in this passage in Isaiah 66:23 through 24. It says, "And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, from month to month, and from one Sabbath to another, week to week, that all flesh shall come to worship before me." And so month after month, week after week, they are coming, says the Lord. "And they shall go forth and look upon the corpses of men who have transgressed against me. For their worm does not die, and their fire is not quenched. They shall be an abhorrence to all flesh. He is talking about people coming month after month, week after week. And as they come month after month, week after week, they see the bodies. They see the bodies on fire, and they see the bodies being eaten by worms. Isaiah is talking about a perpetual punishment. He is talking about a perpetual fire. He is talking about a fire that does not consume and destroy the bodies. He's talking about a worm that eats on the bodies continually, but never completely consumes the bodies. He is talking about bodies that are on fire that you can see month after month, about bodies that are being eaten that you can see month after month. It is a gruesome, horrific picture, but nonetheless, this is what Isaiah is talking about. He speaks of bodies which can be viewed month to month, year to year, because of a perpetual worm and a perpetual fire that continually attacks these bodies but never destroys the body. Again, this is what Isaiah is talking about. My understanding that this is happening in the millennial kingdom, and that this is an earthly time frame. But regardless, he is talking about something that a fire that never consumes the bodies and a worm that never destroys them, but a perpetual fire that continues to burn these bodies endlessly. Okay, so what does Isaiah 66, 23, and 24 point to? Well, it points to this: an unquenchable fire that burns month after month, week after week, year after year, an unquenchable fire. So, regardless of what other passages, how other passages use unquenchable, and we'll talk about that at some point in time, this particular passage in Isaiah, when it talks about an unquenchable fire, it is talking about a fire that burns from Sabbath to Sabbath, from new moon to new moon. It is talking about a fire that is always burning and is perpetual. That's the picture of Isaiah 66:24. Also, it talks about an unquenchable fire that does not destroy the objects within the fire. The bodies are not being consumed. The bodies are not being destroyed. The whole premise of the fire in the annihilationist or the conditional immortality viewpoint is that it is a fire that consumes. Well, here we are presented in Isaiah 66:24 with a fire that does not consume. It is not destroying these bodies. It is speaking of a perpetual state of a fire that does not end and bodies that are not destroyed. Now, it's going to be my argument that in the interpretation of Isaiah 66:24 in Mark chapter 9, that Jesus is not talking about the same thing that Isaiah 66 is talking about. He is just simply, again, using the language of Isaiah 66 and the punishment and judgment of Isaiah 66 to help us understand the judgment of hell. They are similar, and there are similar aspects, and so the one helps us understand the other, but they're not the same thing. My understanding of Isaiah 66 would be that it is talking about the millennial kingdom. It is talking about a time when Jesus Christ is ruling and reigning upon this earth. It is a time that takes place in earth history. And a couple of things just from that section of scripture which would indicate this is that Isaiah 66:20 speaks of offerings being brought. And so the people are bringing offerings. We do not expect there to be a temple nor offerings in the eternal state. Also, Isaiah 66:23 speaks of new moons and Sabbaths. The eternal state has no night or day, and it has no sun. It has no moon. It doesn't have any of these weeks and years and months. It doesn't have these aspects of the passage of time like we do here in this earth. And so these things indicate for us that this is a different state, this is a different time than the new heavens and the new earth. And so what Jesus is talking about, or what the prophet Isaiah is talking about, is an earthly judgment and an earthly time frame and a horrific and terrible judgment of those bodies, of those people. But it's not the same thing as the judgment of Mark chapter 9. Though Isaiah 66 is talking about an earthly judgment and Mark 9 is talking about judgment in the afterlife, they have similar elements, which is why Jesus is quoting Isaiah 66:24. The similar elements are these: a fiery judgment. Hell is understood to be a place of fiery judgment, and the judgment that these people are facing is a fire. There is an unending fire. The fire of Isaiah 64 or 66:24 burns continually, month to month, week to week, and the fire of hell burns continuously, year after year. And in both of these judgments, the victims are not consumed. The bodies remain there in the judgment of Isaiah 66:24 continuously. They are seen, they are observed month after month, week after week, being burned but not consumed. And the fire of hell and the people that are confined there burn continuously, month after month, week after week, and are not consumed. And so these similar elements between the judgment of Isaiah 66:24 and the judgment of Mark 9 make it a good illustration, a good quotation for Jesus to use here to help us understand the judgment and the nature of the judgment that he is talking about. So in Mark 9, in this passage, Jesus uses the language of Isaiah 66:24 to help us understand the judgment of hell that is being threatened in Mark 9. In Mark 9 and in Isaiah 66, the fire and the worm do not consume the victim year after year, but rather the victim is in a perpetual state of being burned or eaten. And so that is my proposition. I think that's what's happening here. Let's look at some other things that will support this understanding. For those who are struggling with this interpretation of Mark chapter 9 and its association with Isaiah 66:24, it should be pointed out, first of all, that Jesus and Mark do not say that this is a fulfillment of Isaiah's judgment. Other places in the book of Mark, the author tells us when we are looking at a fulfillment of prophecy. Like, say, for example, Mark chapter 1 and verse 2, talking about John the Baptist, he says this, as it is written in the prophets, behold, I send a messenger before you. And he directly says, this is the fulfillment of that prophecy. And then he quotes the prophecy. This also happens in Mark chapter 12, verse 10. But here in Mark 9, it does not suggest that this is the fulfillment of the prophecy of Isaiah, nor does it say that it is the same event. In fact, the fact that many people that believe in eternal conscious torment don't see this as a quote or don't recognize this as a quote from Isaiah 66:24 is because Mark doesn't point to it. Mark doesn't indicate that this is a quote from or a fulfillment of Isaiah 66:24. And so, though it is a quote there, and it certainly does look back to that, Mark does not say that this is a fulfillment of that prophecy. And so, again, the earthly judgment of Isaiah 66:24 is being used, I think, to help us understand the afterlife judgment that is being threatened by Jesus. And that is supported, at least in part, by the fact that Jesus does not say, and Mark does not say, that this is a fulfillment of that prophecy. And I think it needs to be noted here. All right, as we continue, we want to look at the Jewish usage of this phrase. And the following is from Judith 16:17. Now, Judith is an apocryphal book. We understand that it is not inspired. It was written about 200 years before Christ, but nonetheless, it does give us a Jewish perspective on these words from Isaiah, how they understood them, or how they were at least being used by the Jewish people in the days of Jesus. And so Judith 16:17 says this: Woe to the nation that rises up against my people. The Lord Almighty will take vengeance on them in that day of judgment. He will send fire and worms into their flesh, and they shall weep in pain forever. And so these words, fire and worms in the flesh, and this concept of fire and worms is used to understand perpetual suffering, perpetual pain, and eternal suffering. Again, as we look at Jesus' words, and as we look at how Jesus is using it, he talks about Gehenna, which Gehenna in the days of Jesus was used as a term for the fiery judgment in the afterlife. And Jesus' usage of the word indicates that he's talking about the fiery judgment in the afterlife. And these words, the worms and the fire, was applied to a fiery judgment that lasts forever. Again, as we think about how Jesus is using these words in this quotation from Isaiah 66:24 in Mark chapter 9, he references hell, and then he uses these words to help us understand the punishment of hell. How is Jesus using them? What does Jesus intend for us to take away from them? Is he talking about dead bodies that are lying in the streets of Jerusalem or lying outside of Jerusalem that people are viewing week after week, month after month? Or is he talking about a judgment in the afterlife that continues on forever? And I think, again, as we are putting all the evidence together, we are beginning to understand how Jesus uses the term, uses this quote from Isaiah 66:24. He is just trying to help us get a sense of the hell, the afterlife judgment that he is threatening the people with. So as we examine Mark 9 and Jesus' quotation of Isaiah 66:24, how do we understand this? Well, I think regardless of your understanding of Isaiah 66:24, and I realize that not everybody out there is a millennialist and believes in the millennial reign of Jesus Christ, but regardless, there are other interpretations of Isaiah 66:24 and what Isaiah is prophesying and the judgment that is being prophesied there. But I think there are sufficient differences between Isaiah 66:24 and Mark chapter 9 to know that these two things are not talking about the exact same event. In Isaiah 66:24, there is an earthly Jerusalem and an earthly judgment, and people coming to Jerusalem and viewing dead bodies. And in Mark chapter 9, he is talking about hell, judgment in the afterlife, which is not a non-earthly experience and a non-earthly thing. And so there's enough difference to understand that they're not talking about the same thing, especially since Jesus nor Mark indicate that this is the fulfillment of Isaiah 66:24. Rather than saying that they are the same event, which the passage and Jesus give no indication of, what we do understand is that there are similarities. The judgment in Isaiah 66:24 involves a fire that burns perpetually and does not consume the victim. And Mark chapter 9 talks about a punishment in which the fire is perpetual and does not consume the victim. And so these two things are in common in both of these judgments, but they're not the same. They are different judgments, and there's enough understanding to see them as different judgments. So in Mark chapter 9, in this passage, Jesus uses the language of Isaiah 66:24 to help us understand the judgment of hell that he is threatening in this passage, in which the fire and the worm do not consume the victim year after year, but rather the victim is in a perpetual state of being burned or eaten. And so those words of Isaiah 66:24 and that judgment of Isaiah 66:24 help us in this way understand what is being threatened to mankind that will experience the judgment of hell. I hope you find this video helpful. If you do, please like or share so that I know to continue making content. Thank you for watching, and please, if you have any responses, put them below. I'd love to hear feedback and understand any arguments, any thoughts that you have upon this video. Thank you.